History and Culture podcasts are a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to PCN's History and Culture podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. This podcast series features interviews exploring Pennsylvania's rich history from the colonial era to industrialization, the Gettysburg Campaign to sports history, and from art to politics and more.
We're here with Heather Sharkey, professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Tell us, who was Alice Paul and why was she important?
Alice Paul was a suffragist of the early 20th century who made a major contribution to securing women voting rights. But she was more than that. She was a women's rights activist generally and also advocated during her career for children's rights.
What rights did women have at the time?
When she was a young woman in the opening years of the 20th century, there were starting to be more educational opportunities for women. But women still didn't receive necessarily equal pay, didn't have equal access. There weren't the same employment opportunities for women. And these were some of the issues that concerned her.
What work did Alice Paul do to further the women's equality movement?
So as a student at Swarthmore College in southeast Pennsylvania, which was incidentally a Quaker institution inspired by ideals of social equality, she became aware of women's rights, expanding educational opportunities, and so forth. She worked for a time in New York City, volunteering with immigrant populations, and then went to Europe. And it was while she was in Europe, and specifically in London, that she encountered the British suffragist movement or suffragette movement and became aware of the possibilities of nonviolent resistance and protest in changing or calling for the improvement of rights for women and for others.
You mentioned Alice going to a Quaker university. She grew up Quaker. What was her upbringing like, and how did that inspire her activism?
She came from a very long-standing Pennsylvania, New Jersey Quaker family that had been in the country since the time of William Penn, and some of her relatives were instrumental in founding Swarthmore College, and also they were involved in the abolition movement to end slavery, and they were advocates for equal educational opportunities for boys and girls, men and women.
What did she study at Swarthmore College?
She herself studied math and science, which was, one of the new opportunities available to women at the time. So, yeah, she had a very keen analytical mind, so I'm not surprised that that's what she went for.
So you mentioned she was in London and she was inspired by the women's rights movement over there. What exactly, did somebody pull her in specifically, or what about it attracted her?
I think growing out of her Quaker upbringing, which, by the way, was also very egalitarian, very much focused on equality between different members of society, simple living, and so forth, she was inspired by the idea of trying to encourage positive social change. And so when she was in London, in fact, she participated in things like the hunger strikes, and she was one of the people who faced imprisonment in London with the other women who were marching in these activities.
How did the British suffrage movement differ from the American?
Well, their protests that they started were somewhat earlier than ours in those sorts of tactics. So there were similar efforts on both sides of the Atlantic and in the English-speaking world to call for the improvement of women's rights. But it was specifically the British suffragettes who then inspired Alice Paul and gave her an idea of potential forms that protest could take. And then when she came back to the United States, she began to implement some of those, but only after she finished her graduate education and secured her PhD.
Talk a little bit about what some of those protest forms that she brought from across the pond to the U.S. were.
Well, one thing was very simply having public events and debates and bringing people together. In many ways, that's a continuation of what Quakers and others were doing already. But she participated in groups in Philadelphia, for example, that would get together and have discussions about child labor laws or women's voting rights and so forth. But it was also the marching, nonviolent marching, and silent protest in some cases, being visible on the streets. Those were some of the tactics that she really introduced and promoted here.
She was part of a group who did something called the Silent Sentinels. What can you tell us about that?
Well, they showed up in front of the White House and marched in Washington, D.C., and their goal was to bring visibility to the movement. And this was after she finished her PhD, just after, around the time of the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson, that they marched to the White House and in the streets of Washington, D.C., and stood outside with signs and placards and, calling for women's voting rights in that case.
How did community and the society at the time react to Alice Paul and the other suffragettes?
They were very, judging from the newspaper reports of the time, many were inspired and shocked by what they were doing, but at the same time respected them insofar as they were not causing any damages to property, and they were respectful in their U.S. protests. And they were very silently attesting to what they believed needed to happen in U.S. society. But really, it's funny because I think those protests are just the most visible part. That's what people remember. Really, what Alice Paul achieved was the slow, quiet, behind-the-scenes work to organize people, to argue rationally for issues, to analyze what was going on. That's not what gets put in movies or plays and stories about Alice Paul. It was really the years of quiet effort, sustained effort behind the scenes that made the difference.
Can you talk about some of those efforts?
Well, one of her efforts was through her scholarship. She studied laws about U.S. women, American women, and also Pennsylvania laws. That's what she ended up doing when she went to the University of Pennsylvania to start her PhD degree. She studied the history of laws in Pennsylvania to see how women's rights had evolved. Actually, there weren't that many rights that they had, in fact, and how things changed over the generations. And then later, after women around the time that women were protesting, and she was leading protests in Washington, D.C., and around the time of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, when women won the right to vote, she started broadening that and looking at things on a national level, and looking at laws and changes in laws, and she wanted to understand what the laws were, but also how and why they changed, and what improved the situation for different people, and what would be the desired outcome of changes. And voting rights were just one small part of what she was doing.
You mentioned her going to University of Pennsylvania to get her PhD. Can you talk a little bit about the significance of the dissertation she wrote while she was in that program?
The dissertation that she wrote, I think, gives really deep insights into the nature of her thought and shows that she was interested in far more than voting rights and saw voting rights as just one part of the equation. Most people now remember her for the voting rights, but what she really did in her dissertation, and I think this is the most significant thing, is she discussed the importance of property rights. Women's ability to control some of the income that they earned. If their husbands or fathers died, their ability to inherit and use the money that they had, the ability of women to have some rights of guardianship over their children. These were the things she wrote about. I think her dissertation, which she never published and which exists in only a manuscript, meaning a handwritten form, at Penn today, shows us that her thinking went way beyond just voting even if that's what people remember her for now. And that she believed very strongly that the best and most important way to improve rights for women would be to enhance their property rights. Or another way she put it in her dissertation is to say economic power translates into political power.
How was the economic system set up then? I know you mentioned, like, did the husbands own the property?
Well, she traces it from the beginning first in her dissertation, from the beginning of Swedish and then Dutch settlement and then English or British settlement in Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And she shows what common laws came to Pennsylvania from England, and they were extraordinarily restrictive. Married women lost control over their property. Their husbands could do anything that they wanted with their money or property. Let's say if a woman inherited something from her father. Only husbands had control over child custody. They had the right to beat their wives and children. Women could not sign contracts and engage in business dealings independently of husbands if they were married. So in all ways, women were, in all significant ways regarding property and the control of their bodies and their families, women were very constrained. But what she sees in her study and what she shows in her dissertation is that there was one moment that she thinks is really significant in the history of women in the United States at large, but specifically in Pennsylvania, and that's 1848, when there's a passage of a new Property Act which recognizes some ability, not full ability, but some ability of women to continue controlling their assets even after they get married. And what's interesting about her dissertation is she shows that the movers and shakers behind passage of that law were actually men. And it was actually fathers who were sort of worried about what would happen to their daughters because they realized that their sons-in-law were turning out to be not terribly reliable. And that's where some of the change came from. And she also discusses, and this is, I think, another very interesting thing about her dissertation, is how changes in Pennsylvania society, which again mirrored larger trends in American society at large, really required or necessitated a change of the laws. They were becoming ill-equipped to handle changing conditions, especially as people moved around more, as industrialization increased, as women became better educated and also had more jobs, and as people realized that women needed to be able to sign business contracts.
Now, you transcribed her unfinished dissertation. Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, it was really exciting. I was teaching a seminar in 2020 to mark the centennial of women's voting rights. And on the first day of class in January 2020, I happened to be writing to the librarian, one of the curators of rare books and manuscripts at Penn. And he said to me, you know, we have Alice Paul's manuscript dissertation. I said, really? Can we come and see it? And so that first day of class with the students, we went to the library and we saw her dissertation. And it was amazing because it's handwritten. And we were flipping through the pages, and he said, you know, somebody should really transcribe this, meaning like write down what the dissertation says, because nobody's ever really looked at this. Then, as you can possibly guess, COVID hit. The university shut down, and we still had this interest in Alice Paul's dissertation, and at that point the librarian said, you know what, I have an old scan that I made of it many years ago. And what ended up happening is that the students and I, as a COVID lockdown project, began to transcribe her dissertation, which was really hard, actually, because the handwriting is in some places really messy, and it had not been digitized. I think it would be difficult to digitize something that's so messy, so it was actually kind of hard to do, and it took a long time.
What surprised you about some of the things you saw in this dissertation?
Well, there were a number of things. One, materially, what surprised us is that we saw many different handwritings. Thinking about these papers as a physical object, it made us realize that Alice Paul we know she wrote some of it herself. We can see where it's her handwriting. We can see where other people wrote parts of it. There are a few pages at the end that are typed, so typewriters are starting to come in. So as a physical document, it's actually very interesting to see that. But I would say as we transcribed it, what surprised us was to realize what a broad view she had of the landscape of women's rights and how it was tied into economic history. And some of it, honestly, is difficult to read because the cases that she describes are so harrowing.
How many pages is the dissertation?
Oh, I'd have to look it up again. I forget. It's because like some of them are just like it will be a partial page, and so it's like a scrap page scribbled halfway. So it's a couple of hundred pages of different levels of density of text.
Is the dissertation unfinished?
Yes, and that's one of the things that we started to write about. According to, afterwards, after we transcribed it, I actually started to write an article about this, and we discussed how the dissertation was never, the university should have a copy of the final form of the dissertation, and she should have published it, but all the university has is this manuscript, very rough manuscript, draft copy. And so it is not a finished copy. And I think that's also why people don't know what's in it. And many people, if you'll see references to it, even on the Wikipedia page now, which claim that her dissertation is about women's voting rights and the suffrage movement. It's not. It's about women's property rights and the changing place of women in law, with voting as one part of that, with a focus on Pennsylvania.
Now, around this time, as Alice was, going through school, writing her dissertation, and the women's suffrage movement, World War I broke out. How did that affect the women's suffrage movement in the United States?
Well, this is after the part of the history that we studied, because she finished her dissertation in 1912, began her activism, and it was just before World War I broke out. What many observers say is that the course of the war and the roles that women had to assume while so many men went off to fight increased public sympathy for the ability of women to be responsible voters and citizens and so forth, so that eventually that paved the way for the 19th Amendment.
The 19th Amendment was passed in 1920. What did that say?
The amendment said that there shall be no discrimination on the basis of sex in voting.
Did Alice have any involvement in the passage of this amendment? Did anything she say help them when they were voting on this amendment?
Well, there were the conscious efforts and behind-the-scenes efforts to make support for passage on a state-by-state basis happen, to increase public awareness and visibility, and talking to people and writing letters and getting out into the streets and all that kind of behind-the-scenes organizing. It's somewhat hard to see exactly how that process worked, because as many people have noted, she was an incredibly hardworking person who worked very late hours, but she was very private, and she was not even very charismatic or self-promoting. So that also makes it harder for people to realize exactly what she was doing on a day-to-day basis. I think that's also why people tend to focus so much on her marches, because that's where she was very visible and it was obvious and it was strong. But mostly, she was very much a behind-the-scenes, slow, painstaking work kind of person.
Where did some of these marches occur?
Well, mostly the most visible ones in Washington, D.C. That's where they were focusing their efforts.
Lastly, what is Alice Paul's legacy today?
That's a really good question. And I think we, meaning Americans, are still working through that. I think the most common answer would be to say the greatest, most lasting legacy is what she achieved for women's voting rights. But, she spent the rest of her career, the next 50 years after women secured the right to vote, she was still working. And what was she doing? One of the big things was she was trying to promote the Equal Rights Amendment to secure equality for men and women in employment. She was also doing a lot of international work in trying to create international solidarity networks. So she continued to work for many years. I think looking back at her dissertation, what I would now say is that more inspiring for me, even than the great things she did with getting the women the right to vote, was her analysis of and belief in the importance of women's economic empowerment.
We've been speaking with Heather Sharkey, professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PCN's history and culture content, like the interview you just heard, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. Explore other documentary programs, event coverage, and a lot more. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.